"Welcome home, new mama." The words were painted in wide, crooked red letters across a flour sack banner strung between the two porch posts. Grace Calloway stood on the hardpan earth with her carpet bag in one hand and her ticket stub still tucked in the other, and she could not move. The banner sagged a little in the middle where the string had given, and one corner had been tied too low, so the letters ran slightly downhill, the way a child's hand will wander when it is working very hard at something. She looked at those words and felt a door open somewhere in the center of her chest that she had not known was there. She had come 200 miles on a train that smelled of coal smoke and wet wool. She had answered a notice in a Kansas City paper that read, plainly as bread, "Widower with son, age 6, seeks capable woman for honest arrangement. Good land, fair terms. No pretense intended or desired." She had written back in her careful schoolteacher's hand and received a reply in return that was equally plain, neither warm nor cold, just true. The man's name was Gideon Harlow. He needed help with his boy and his homestead. She needed a future that was hers to keep. They had each signed a letter of agreement, and here she was, standing in the September dust outside Silver Creek, Idaho, staring at a flour sack banner that a 6-year-old had painted for her. A screen door banged. "You're here," said a voice, low and careful, the way a man speaks when he has decided ahead of time not to say too much. Grace looked up. Gideon Harlow stood on the porch steps, tall, weathered, with the kind of stillness that comes not from ease but from long practice holding still. He wore a clean shirt. She noticed that. It was the only sign of preparation he permitted himself. "I'm here," she said. He came down one step and took her bag before she could argue it. Behind him, the screen door opened again, and a small boy appeared, dark-eyed and solemn, clutching a paintbrush that had left a red smear across his left palm. "I made the sign," the boy said. "My name's Eli." Grace crouched down to his level. Up close, she could see the care that had gone into each letter, the way he'd pressed so hard the brush had bled at the edges. "I can see that," she said. "It's the finest sign I ever had." Eli studied her with the frank assessment of a child who has learned to read strangers quickly. Then he said, "Papa said you might stay. Are you going to stay?" Grace glanced up at Gideon, who was watching her with those careful, unreadable eyes. "I intend to," she said. She meant it practically. She was not prepared for how much she already meant it otherwise. The sun was dropping behind the ridge, painting the dust gold, and somewhere in the near pasture, a horse blew through its nose in the settling quiet. Gideon Harlow said nothing. He just stepped aside and held the screen door open, and that was as close to welcome as a man like him knew how to come. Grace Calloway walked through it. Inside, the house smelled of pine resin and wood smoke, and something that had once been supper. The kitchen was large and honest. The floor had been swept. She could tell from the broom marks still visible near the hearth. Someone had tried. She set her small traveling hat on the peg by the door and looked around at the work that waited for her, and she felt, for the first time in a very long while, that she was standing exactly where she was supposed to be. She did not know yet how hard the winter would be. She did not know about the water rights dispute that was gathering like a storm to the north, or the neighbors who would talk, or the way Gideon Harlow woke before dawn and stood on the porch staring at the land as though he expected it to disappear. She did not know that the bargain she had struck was going to cost her more than she had planned, and give her more in return than she had ever thought to ask. All she knew, right then, was the smear of red paint on a little boy's hand and the door that had opened in her chest. That was enough to begin. Supper that first night was a quiet affair. Gideon had made salt pork and potatoes, and he served it without apology, which Grace respected. She had eaten worse and pretended otherwise. She saw no reason to perform gratitude here. She ate what was on her plate and refilled Eli's cup when it emptied without being asked, and the boy watched her do it the way children watch things they want to remember. "You were a teacher?" Gideon said. It was not quite a question. 4 years in Pratt County, Grace said, before the school board decided to hire a man instead. Their loss, he said, and went back to eating. It was the first uncalculated thing he'd said to her. Grace filed it away and said nothing. After supper, Gideon washed the plates and Grace dried them, and Eli sat at the table drawing on a scrap of paper with a stub of pencil. He drew with the same pressed concentration he'd given the sign, his tongue tucked at the corner of his mouth. Grace watched him in the small mirror of the window glass while she dried a tin cup. "What are you drawing?" she asked. "Our family," he said, without looking up. Grace set the cup down carefully. Gideon, at the basin, did not turn around, but she saw his shoulders change, a barely perceptible shift, as though something had moved in him that he did not mean to show. They had agreed on terms. She would keep the house, tend the garden, see to Eli's lessons, and help through the harvest. He would provide room, board, and a wage, modest but honest, and if at the end of 1 year either party found the arrangement wanting, they would part as they had met, plainly and without rancor. It was a practical agreement between two practical people, and Grace had told herself on the train that practical was plenty. She had not accounted for a 6-year-old drawing their family on a scrap of paper the first night she arrived. She had not accounted for Gideon Harlow's shoulders either, and the way they held a grief he never mentioned but carried everywhere like a second coat. His wife had died 3 years before. Fever, in the February cold. He had told Grace this in his second letter, plain and short, the way he told her everything, as a fact she deserved to know, not as a wound he meant to display. Grace had lost her own mother to fever, and she understood the particular loneliness of a grief you have had time to get used to but never quite do. She did not say any of this. She put the dried cup on the shelf and picked up the next one. When Eli was in bed, tucked in by his father with a brevity that suggested routine more than coldness, a kiss on the forehead that was small and sure, Gideon came back to the kitchen and poured 2 cups of coffee without asking if she wanted one. She did. He sat across the table from her in the lamplight, and the house creaked around them in the wind, and he said, "The boy took to you fast." "He's a good boy," Grace said. "He is," Gideon said. There was something in the way he said it, a fierceness kept very quiet, the way a man keeps a candle cupped against the wind. "He's had a hard few years." "So have you," Grace said. He looked at her then, directly, for the first time since she'd arrived. His eyes were dark brown and older than his face. He seemed to be deciding something. Then he said, "The terms of our agreement stand, Miss Calloway. I want to be plain about that. I'm not looking to add complications." "Neither am I," Grace said, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I came here to work and to be useful. I expect nothing more than what we agreed." He nodded once. It was the nod of a man who has been disappointed before and is trying very hard not to be again. Grace finished her coffee and said goodnight and went to the small room off the kitchen that was hers. She unpacked her carpet bag with the methodical calm she had learned to practice over years of keeping her composure in front of children who were watching, to see if she would. She hung her 2 good dresses on the peg. She set her Bible on the windowsill. She placed the small photograph of her mother face up on the bedside shelf, in the particular way she did wherever she slept, so that she was not entirely alone. Then she lay down in the narrow bed under a quilt that was well made and faded, and she listened to the Idaho wind work itself against the eaves, and she thought about a little boy who had painted "Welcome Home," "New Mama" in crooked red letters, and waited all afternoon in the heat to show her. She did not cry. She had not cried in a long time. But she lay there in the dark with that open door in her chest and thought that practical was, perhaps, a smaller word than she had always believed. Morning came early in the Harlow household. Grace discovered this when Eli appeared at her door before full light, fully dressed but with his boots on the wrong feet, to inform her that the chickens needed feeding and that this had previously been Papa's job, but Papa said that was one of the things she might like to help with, if she wanted. "I want," Grace said, and reached for her boots. The days took shape around her the way water finds its course, not all at once, but steadily, seeking the lowest and most natural path. She learned the house, which floorboard sang in the night, where the good knife was kept, that the wood stove drafted better when the damper was set to 3/4 and not full. She learned Eli, that he was quieter than most boys his age and watched things more carefully, that he flinched at raised voices, not from fear exactly, but from the readiness of a child who has learned that loud sounds often mean something is wrong, and that he was ferociously, tenderly loyal to his father. She learned Gideon in pieces, the way you learn a landscape in changing light. He rose before dawn. She knew this because she rose early herself, and would sometimes hear him on the porch in the dark, the slow sound of his boot on the boards. He never explained it. She never asked. But she started leaving a cup of coffee on the kitchen windowsill where he could see it when he came in, and one morning she found a small bunch of late-season wildflowers left on the table, cut rough and quick, without any note. She put them in a tin cup of water and said nothing, and neither did he. It was Eli who told her, in his straightforward way, that Papa never picked flowers. "Not since Mama," he said, and went back to the wooden horse he was carving badly and earnestly out of a stick with a borrowed penknife. Grace looked at the tin cup of flowers on the table. Then she looked back at Eli. "You're whittling a horse," she said. "It's supposed to be," Eli said. "It mostly looks like a dog." "May I?" She held out her hand, and he gave her the stick and knife. She turned it in her fingers, considering. "It could be either," she said. "Depends what you decide it is." Eli squinted at it. "It's a horse," he said firmly. "Then it's a horse," Grace said and handed it back. She began, quietly, to tend to the things that had been left to slip. She rechinked the window frames against the coming cold, working the clay in with her hands the way she'd watched her uncle do it as a girl. She mended the curtains in the front room, which had pulled loose at the rod. She found a cast-iron pot that had been sitting in the corner with a cracked handle and took it to the smithy in town and had it welded, and when she brought it home and hung it on its hook, Gideon looked at it for a long moment and said nothing, which was, she had learned, his version of thank you. She started Eli on his letters. He was behind where he should be for a boy of 6, not from slowness but from interruption, the fever year, the year after, 2 years without anyone to sit with him and teach. He was quick when he had the chance to be. Within 2 weeks he could write his name in letters that marched across the page in reasonable order. He showed his father at supper, holding the paper up, and Gideon looked at it and then looked at Grace. "That's good work," he said, to Eli, but he meant it for her too. She could tell. She planted herself in the small rhythms of that house, as deliberately as she planted the garlic sets along the south wall of the kitchen garden, pushing them into the cooling earth one by one, knowing she would not see their green shoots until spring. You do not plant for the season you are in. You plant for the one that's coming. The first trouble reached Silver Creek in mid-October, arriving in the form of a man in a wool coat who came to the door on a Tuesday morning, while Gideon was in the far field. His name was Aldous Pruitt. He represented the Silver Creek Land and Water Association, and he had the smooth manner of a person who has learned to make bad news sound like opportunity. He wanted to speak with Mr. Harlow, he said, about the creek that ran along the eastern edge of the Harlow property, specifically about the association's intention to reroute its flow to serve the new mill operation going in 4 miles north. "Mr. Harlow is in the fields," Grace said. She did not open the screen door all the way. "And you are?" Pruitt said, with a small, assessing smile. "Mrs. Harlow," Grace said. She had not planned to say it. It came out as what it was. the plainest, most effective answer to the question being asked, and she did not flinch from it. Pruitt's smile adjusted. "Well, Mrs. Harlow, perhaps you could give your husband this." He held out a folded document, sealed with red wax. "It's a formal notice of intent. The association will be filing with the county clerk by the 1st of November. He'd do well to consult with us before then." Grace took the document. "I'll see he gets it." "I trust you'll encourage him to be reasonable," Pruitt said. "The association is prepared to offer fair compensation." "I'm sure it is," Grace said, in the tone she used with children who were trying to get around a rule. She gave Gideon the document at noon. He read it standing at the kitchen table, still in his field coat, not sitting. The way he read things he did not want to sit down for. He read it through twice, folded it, set it on the table. "That creek feeds the south pasture," he said. "Takes it out. I can't carry the herd through winter." "I know," Grace said. He looked at her. "You told him you were my wife." "It was the most efficient answer," she said. "He would have come back in the evening with different tactics if I'd told him otherwise. This way he thinks he's dealing with a household, not a man alone." Gideon was quiet for a moment. Outside, the wind had picked up and was carrying the smell of cold coming down off the ridge. "That was quick thinking," he said. "I've dealt with men like that before," Grace said. "School boards are full of them." The ghost of something crossed his face. Not quite a smile, but the country it bordered on. He picked up the document again. "I need to talk to Harlan Deeds. He had trouble with the association 2 years back. Found a clause in the original water grant that stopped them." "Then you should go today," Grace said. "I'll keep Eli." He did go, and she kept Eli, and they spent the afternoon at the table. Letters for a while, then the wooden horse that looked like a dog, then a game Eli invented, involving pebbles and a piece of string that had no discernible rules, but which he played with absolute seriousness. Eli ate his supper without being coaxed and said his prayers without being reminded, and went to bed mostly willing, and Grace sat by the lamp with her mending and listened to the wind and waited. Gideon came home after dark. She heard his horse in the yard and then his step on the porch, heavier than usual, the step of a man who has been carrying something in his mind all the way home. She poured the coffee she had kept warm and set it at his place. He sat down. He wrapped his hands around the cup. "Deeds thinks there's a case," he said. "The original homestead grant includes riparian rights. They're not as clear as Deeds would like, but they're there. It'll take a lawyer. Cost something." "How much?" Grace said. "More than I have easy." He said it without embarrassment, as a fact. "The association's counting on that." Grace looked at her hands in her lap. She had some money, not much, but the wages she'd saved from 4 years of teaching, kept in a tin box in the lining of her carpet bag, because she had never trusted banks, and never had enough to make trusting them worthwhile. "I have $40, she said. The silence that followed was careful. "That's your money," Gideon said. "I know it is," Grace said, "and this is my home, according to what I told Mr. Pruitt this morning. Seems right that I should have a stake in keeping it." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, and something moved through his face that she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude alone, not exactly, but the look of a man who has been a long time carrying a thing by himself and has just, unexpectedly, been offered a hand on the other end. "I'll pay it back," he said. "That's not—" "I'll pay it back, Grace." He said her name. It was the first time he had used it. She'd been Miss Calloway until now, as though the name held the terms of the agreement, and he'd been keeping his hands on those terms carefully. He said it like a door opening 1 inch. "That's not charity. That's a loan. I don't take charity." "Understood," she said. He nodded, drank his coffee. Outside, the wind did what it always did in October in Idaho. After a while, he said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know," Grace said. He sat with that for a long moment, turning the cup in his hands. Then, quietly, "Thank you." She said, "You're welcome," and went back to her mending, and the lamp burned between them, and neither one of them said anything more, and the house held them both in its careful, creaking silence. November came in hard. The snow arrived 2 weeks early, not the gentle first snow that children run out to catch on their tongues, but the serious kind, the kind that means business, that comes down overnight and doesn't stop until the world has been rearranged. Grace woke to it and lay still for a moment, listening to the changed silence of a land under snow, which is different from any other silence, deeper and more final. Eli pressed his face to the kitchen window and said, "It's too much snow, isn't it?" "It's a fair amount," Grace agreed. "Papa says when it comes early, it stays late. Your papa knows this land." Eli turned from the window. He had grown, she thought, in just the weeks she had been here. Not taller, not exactly, but more settled in himself, the way a plant will stand straighter when it is getting enough water. "Are you going to stay?" he asked. "Past the year?" Grace was cracking eggs into the skillet. "Where did that come from?" she said. "Tommy Griggs at the mill said his ma said you were a hired woman, and you'd leave come spring. He said it the way children deliver painful information, with a kind of braced honesty, wanting it to not be true but needing to know." Grace set down the egg. She turned around and looked at Eli straight. "I am not a hired woman," she said carefully. "I made an agreement with your father, that is true. But agreements can change. I intend to stay as long as your father and I both decide this is where I belong." She paused. "Right now it is." Eli considered this with great seriousness. "Papa doesn't like it when people leave," he said. It was the most he had ever said about his mother. Grace crossed the kitchen and crouched down in front of him, the way she had the very first day. "I know," she said. "I'm not planning to." He put his arms around her neck then, quick and hard, the hug of a child who has been holding something in, and she held him back, and neither of them said anything else, and the snow kept falling outside. The Water Association filed its petition on the 1st of November, as promised. Gideon hired a lawyer out of Boise named Marcus Webb, a careful, quiet man who reminded Grace of a church deacon, and Webb filed a counterclaim citing the original homestead grant's riparian provisions. The association's man came back twice more, once with a revised offer, once with a veiled suggestion that men who made trouble for the association sometimes found their credit at the mill suddenly unavailable. Gideon stood on the porch and let the man finish talking. Then he said, "We're done here." Just that, 4 words. The association's man looked at him for a moment, seemed to take his measure, and left. Grace, who had heard this from the kitchen window, picked up her wooden spoon and went back to stirring. That same week, a different kind of trouble came, smaller and sharper, the personal kind. Gideon's mother-in-law, a woman named Harriet Dowd, arrived from Boise on the Thursday stage. She was a compact, dry-eyed woman in black wool who had opinions she did not bother to soften and a particular way of looking at Grace that said everything she felt she was too genteel to say aloud. She sat at the kitchen table on her first evening and watched Grace serve supper and said, to the air somewhere above Eli's head, "My daughter kept this house very well." "I'm sure she did," Grace said. "Clara had a gift for it. It was natural to her." "The house is in good order," Gideon said. It was the only thing he said on the subject. Harriet Dowd looked at him. Then she looked at Grace. Then she looked at her plate. Eli said loudly, "Grace taught me to write my name. Want to see Grandma Harriet?" Harriet Dowd's face did something complicated. She looked at the boy, and the hard edges softened, briefly, the way ice softens near a stove without quite melting. "Show me," she said. Eli ran for his paper. That night, when Harriet was settled in the front room and Eli was in bed, Gideon found Grace in the kitchen, and stood in the doorway for a moment before he spoke. "She doesn't mean harm," he said. "She just misses Clara." "I know," Grace said. "I'm not offended. You should be." Grace looked at him. "She's an old woman who lost her daughter. I can absorb a few hard looks." She turned back to the basin. "You don't have to defend me, Gideon." "I know I don't have to," he said. "I wanted to." She stilled her hands in the water. He stayed in the doorway a moment longer. Then he said, quieter, "You handled Eli today. What he said about Tommy Griggs' mother. He just needed the truth." "He needed more than that. He needed someone who—" Gideon stopped. He was not a man who finished every sentence he started, and Grace had learned to wait. "He needed to know you weren't going to disappear," he said finally. "I'm not," Grace said. He looked at her with those old, careful eyes. "I know," he said. "I've known for a while." The next morning she found a new shelf installed above the kitchen work table, cut from fresh pine and fitted with 2 small iron hooks. She had mentioned 3 weeks earlier that it would be useful to have a place to hang the drying herbs off the floor. She had mentioned it once. He had said nothing. She stood in front of that shelf for a long time. Then she took down the tin cup, the one that had held the wildflowers, and set it on the shelf where she could see it. The water rights case was decided in their favor on the 3rd day of December. Marcus Webb sent word by telegraph. Riparian provision upheld. Association enjoined from diversion. Gideon read the telegram at the kitchen table and set it down very carefully, the way you set down something fragile. And then he pressed the heels of his hands against his eyes for a moment, in the way of a man who has been braced for disaster so long he is not entirely sure what to do when it doesn't come. "It's done," Grace said. "It's done," he said. Eli, who had been told enough to understand that something important had been at stake, said, "Does that mean we keep the creek?" "We keep the creek," Gideon said. Eli ran outside to look at it, as though to confirm it was still there. It was. It ran black and fast in its ice-edged banks, and he stood on the bank and looked at it with the pure, proprietary satisfaction of a boy who has been told something belongs to his family and now believes it. Gideon followed him out. Grace watched them from the kitchen window, the tall man and the small boy standing at the water's edge together, not talking, just standing the way the Harlow men did, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. She watched Gideon put his hand on Eli's shoulder. She watched Eli lean into it. She put on her coat and went out. The cold was clean and absolute, the kind that makes the world very clear. She walked down to where they were standing and stood beside them, and Gideon looked at her and then back at the creek, and for a while none of them said anything at all. Then Eli reached out and took Grace's hand. Just that. No announcement, no preamble. He reached out and took her hand the way he would take the hand of someone he was sure of. Grace felt the open door in her chest swing wider. That Christmas Eve she made gingerbread from a recipe her mother had written on a card in faded ink, and the house filled with the smell of it, dark and sweet and warming, until even the cold that pressed at the windows seemed to back off a little. Eli decorated each piece with the gravity of a person performing a sacred task, pressing sugar crystals into the dough with one finger, his tongue at the corner of his mouth. Gideon came in from the barn, stopped in the kitchen doorway, and breathed the smell in without saying anything, in the way of a man who is letting something reach him that he has been keeping at arm's length. "It smells like something," Eli said. "Like Christmas," Grace said. "Like before," Eli said. He looked up at his father. "Like Grandma Dowd's house." Gideon said, "Yeah." His voice was not quite steady. "It does." He sat down at the table. He watched Grace and Eli work, and after a while he picked up a piece of dough and pressed a few crystals in himself, badly, and Eli told him he was doing it wrong, and he said he knew it, and Eli showed him the right way, and he did it better, and Eli nodded with satisfaction. Later, when Eli was asleep, Grace was putting the last gingerbread on the cooling rack when Gideon said, from the table, "I want to ask you something." She set the rack down. "The terms we agreed to," he said. 1 year. Either party walks away at the end, no rancor. He paused. "I'd like to change the terms." Grace turned around. He was sitting very straight, the way a man sits when he is making himself be honest. "What terms would you put in their place?" She said. "Permanent ones," he said. "If you're willing." He met her eyes. "I won't dress it up. I'm not good at that. You know what this life is. You've been living it. I know the bargain wasn't supposed to be more than what we wrote down. But what you've done here, for Eli, for this house, it's been something more than what you contracted for." He stopped and started again. "And I think what I feel when I see you at this table or out in the yard with my boy is also more than I contracted for. So I'm asking, plain." Grace looked at him in the lamplight, this man who cut flowers once in a whole year and built a shelf for the herbs, who stood on the porch in the dark and said thank you like it cost him something, who put his hand on his son's shoulder and let it say everything his voice couldn't. "I'm not good at dressing things up either," she said, "so I'll be plain back. I came here for practical reasons. Practical was all I was planning on." She paused. It turned into more. "For me too." He got up from the table and came across the kitchen to where she was standing, and he took her hand, carefully, the way he did everything, as though he was aware of the weight of it, and he held it in both of his. "Then we'll change the terms," he said. "We'll change the terms," she said. They stood like that in the Christmas kitchen for a long moment, not saying anything, with the gingerbread cooling on the rack and the lamp burning down toward its end, and the Idaho winter pressing its hands against the windows and failing to get in. Spring came slowly to Silver Creek, the way it always does in that high country, grudgingly, then all at once, like a grudge given up. The snow pulled back from the south slopes first, showing the earth beneath still brown and matted but alive. The creek ran fast with snowmelt. Eli found the first green shoot in Grace's kitchen garden and called her out to see it with the urgency of a boy announcing a miracle, and she came running. By April, the garlic she had planted in the autumn was pushing green fingers through the soil. She crouched among the rows and looked at it and felt the satisfaction of a thing planted in faith coming true. Gideon came up beside her. He stood the way he always stood, still and steady, looking at what she was looking at. "You put those in last fall," he said. "I did," she said. "You plant for the season that's coming." He reached down and touched one of the green shoots with 2 fingers, lightly, the way you touch something you are glad to find, and then he straightened up and held out his hand to her. She took it and stood. Eli came running across the yard with his boots sending up bright sprays of mud, and he was shouting something about a nest he'd found in the top rail of the fence, and she caught him with her free hand before he ran straight through the garlic bed, and all 3 of them stood there at the edge of the garden in the April mud with the sun finally warm on their faces, and Eli was already pulling them both toward the fence to see the nest, and she let herself be pulled. Behind them, the house stood in the morning light with its porch and its screen door and its new shelf in the kitchen window. The flour sack banner was gone now. It had given way in a November wind, but Grace had kept it, folded, in the bottom of her carpet bag. She kept it the way you keep the thing that first opens a door in you. Gideon looked at her over Eli's head, and what passed between them in that look was not complicated. It was simply this: "There you are, and here I am, and here is the boy between us, and this is the life we made from what we bargained for, and it is more than we bargained for." It was more. It was enough. It was home. And the creek ran on in its banks, kept and right, and the land held them in its long, patient way, and the garlic grew. There are people in this world who set out looking for love, and spend their whole lives hunting it down the wrong roads. And there are others, like Grace and Gideon, who set out looking for something practical, something survivable, and find that love has been waiting quietly in the simplest things all along, in a child's painted sign, in a cup of coffee left on a windowsill, in a shelf built for the herbs you mentioned once and didn't think he'd heard. That is the secret this old frontier knew better than most places. Love doesn't need a grand announcement. It just needs a door left open and two people brave enough to walk through it. Now, dear friend, tell me in the comments, was it the sign that got you, or the shelf? Which moment made you know that bargain was going to become something real? If stories like Grace and Gideon's are the ones that fill your heart, subscribe and stay close. There are more waiting for you right here, warm and honest, each one worth the telling. Good night. God bless. Until next time.